morning. I'm Bonnie Gardner. I'm co-chair of the Public Affairs Forum of the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Austin. Welcome. Our programs are held most Sundays at noon at 4700 Grover Avenue. They're free and open to the public. Our mission is to nourish the mind and the spirit and serve social justice. You can find more information on our church website at www.austinuu.org. Today's forum is dedicated to the memory of Kitty Clark, who was a founding member of the Public Affairs Forum and who served on the forum committee for about 50 years. Kitty was a member of the Teachers Union and a staunch supporter of organized labor. She was never afraid to challenge exploitation or injustice wherever she found them, and she used her considerable personal influence and her union affiliations to serve the public interest. Most people don't really realize that the efforts of organized labor in the last 100 years are mainly responsible for improvements in working conditions and standard of living in the U.S. We often take these things for granted now, although they seem to be eroding away. Prior to the emergence of organized labor in this country, there were few worker protections. Workplaces were hazardous. There were no work weeks limited to 40 hours, no weekends, no mandated breaks or access to restrooms, no sick leave or paid vacation, and child labor was routine. There were no minimum wages. And the rise of the middle class in this country and our greatness as a nation really is largely an outgrowth of hard-fought victories by labor unions. We are indeed indebted to organized labor. And now Eric Hartman, one of our forum committee members, is going to introduce today's speaker, Rick Levy. Eric?
Thank you, Bonnie. It's an honor for me to do this today for my friend Rick Levy. I know that Kitty Clark, a longtime friend and ally in the labor movement, would also be very proud that we're having Rick as our speaker today. She would recognize in him a kindred spirit, a fighter who understands that you can have a good fight and still keep your sense of humor, and who can keep on going for decade after decade in that spirit. Rick, after finishing up his undergrad degree at Stanford and his law degree at Northeastern, found his way to Tyler, Texas to start practicing employment law, and has been at it ever since. He was in private practice in Austin as well, but soon became the legal director for the Texas AFL-CIO and worked really hard in that capacity for 25 years, and was developed a reputation not only as a great advocate in the courtroom and administrative proceedings and at the Capitol, but also as a great teacher of labor law and labor rights around the state. Rick has also just recently been elected as one of the top 2 elected officers of the Texas AFL-CIO, the Secretary-Treasurer. And in that capacity, he's already begun doing some pioneering work in developing the kind of community coalitions, community alliances that are needed nowadays to make some headway on issues of workplace justice, economic justice, social justice. He's accustomed to working in an adverse environment at the Capitol, and yet somehow manages to command the respect and admiration and affection of people who are bitterly opposed to labor in many other ways. It's quite an achievement, but he's done it without throttling back one iota on his convictions. Just to illustrate the sort of stubborn convictions of this man, after all these years, in an ocean of Houston Astros and Texas Rangers fans, he remains a loyal supporter of his hometown St. Louis Cardinals baseball team. And that's Rick applauding. Anyway, please join me in welcoming Rick Levy.
Oh. That's very sweet. Thank you, my brother. Appreciate it. Wow, that was, thank you, Eric. To be mentioned in the same sentence as Kitty, number one, is certainly reason enough to get up on a Sunday, well, it's not even Sunday morning, to arrive in church on Sunday afternoon for this little Jewish boy from St. Louis. But your words are very meaningful to me, Eric. If I could take just a brief moment, and you know, a lot of times when we go to our different churches and congregations, there's people that we sit with all the time and we don't really understand who they are in the real world. And in Eric, you all have one of the most respected advocates for working people in all of Texas. There's nobody that I would personally rather be with in a fight at the Capitol in terms of commitment, intellect, strategy, and comradeship. And so you all should be very aware that you have a very special person in your midst, and I appreciate very much your introduction. Thank you. What I thought I would do is I would ask the question, a lot of times when we talk about organized labor, people don't really understand what organized labor is. I think a lot of you all do. But the AFL-CIO is really one big coalition in itself. It consists of all the different unions that exist in all the different sectors of the economy and all the different parts of the state. And we come together and we seek dignity and justice for all working people. And we think that that's generally a good thing for society. There are those, increasingly loud in number and influence, who don't think that we're a very good thing and spend considerable portions of their waking hours trying to figure out how to get rid of us. And one of the questions that is always asked, and you've probably heard it, is, well, unions were pretty good back in the day, around the turn of the century. They were probably important then because back then employers did bad things. But are unions really necessary anymore? Has anybody heard that question asked? You've heard that question. All right, thank you. So that's the question that I wanted to answer, and I wanted to talk about. Number one, are they necessary? And if they're necessary, what are they doing to justify their existence? So on this 133rd, I believe, Labor Day, let's pause and discuss this question together if we could. So back in 1954, there were about 35% of all workers in this country belonged to a union. That was kind of the high mark in our country. In 1988, that figure was down to 20%. And today, that figure is 12%. So I'm thinking that's not trending in a way that I think is necessarily good for working people. And so the question about that is, well, those are just numbers. Does it matter? Does it matter that only now 11% of workers belong to unions? And I would suggest to you that it does. Let me read to you the first sentence, if I can, of a recent article in the New York Times on our economy. Despite steady gains in hiring, a falling unemployment rate, and other signs of an improving economy, take-home pay for many American workers has effectively fallen since the economic recovery began in 2009. Okay? So there you have the notion that even as the sea is rising, our boats are not rising along with the tide. And not only are they not rising, they're falling. And so as more wealth is created and we have less wealth, what does that mean? That means that more wealth is concentrated at the very top of our economic spectrum. So when you think about it, unions, even when we only represented 35% of the workers, our impact was so far beyond that because we worked and we set the standards for other people. So the prototypical employer in the 1950s and 1960s was General Motors. And General Motors was a very stable workforce. It was a highly paid workforce. When the UAW and the auto workers and the General Motors and the other automakers, when they bargained and reached a contract, that set the standard for the entire industry. And everybody who wanted to attract skilled labor or labor at all had to reflect that in terms of attracting workers. That was what set the floor. That was what set the tone for our economy. And so now what is it? Well, recently I think it would be, Walmart was the largest employer in this country. And so what are the standards that Walmart sets? Minimum wage, less than full-time work, no access to health care benefits, no rights to have a voice on the job. And so Walmart then became the entity that set the tone for what would be going on in workplaces across this country. And of course, Walmart has been one of the most vicious opponents of unions that we've seen in this country. But now there's even a new development. Did anybody see the article recently about Amazon and their labor practices. So Amazon has now taken over from Walmart as the largest private employer, which is shocking to me, in the United States. And Amazon has this culture of, I don't know what you would call it, cannibalism or dog-eat-dog world where every day workers are encouraged to tell on each other, to point out their shortcomings, to climb over other workers by putting them down, superhuman requirements in terms of breakneck pace, etc. And folks have no recourse whatsoever on the job. And so now we have this kind of high-tech economy, we have the service economy of Walmart, and it's increasingly those entities that are setting the tone for all labor relations in this country. And so when it comes to the workplace, we see that corporate power is increasingly unchecked, and workers are seen as disposable, dispensable units of production. And the more you can wring out of a worker, the higher the profit, the better the shareholders' return. And it's a cycle that ends up with situations where, despite steady gains in hiring, falling unemployment, and other signs of improving economy, take-home pay for workers is dropping. And so that's bad enough. If I'm not trying to cheer you all up, so yet, not trying to cheer you up yet. But we see there's some more bad news. And so what we see now is that what is happening in the corporate world, in the world of business, is also effectively happening in our political system. As the ability to affect change in the legislature is stifled by unchecked corporate money and contributions. When I first started working in the Texas legislature in 1990, I came there with the idea that, I think that money kind of has an important role in politics. And I would say that I had no idea the role that money plays in politics. What makes a viable candidate? Is it their views? Is it their ability to articulate a vision? No. You have to show that you have access to unchecked sources of money. That's the entry fee into American politics. And with Citizens United, the decision that allowed corporations to use their funds unchecked in political campaigns, we see that any ability to move an agenda on a mass level, at a national level, or even a state level here in Texas is effectively checked. And so Texas has become not, in my opinion, it is a conservative state, but more than that, it's a non-voting state. People don't vote their interest in Texas. And so we have a situation where if the vast majority of people would actually vote, we would win, but they don't. And it's not altogether irrational, despite the bashing that we do of people that don't vote, because what they can look and they can see that in many, many cases, by simply voting, what good is it going to do? What difference is it going to make? When money certainly controls everything. What does my vote have to do with it? So that's not irrational. And so in the dynamic of this happening in the South, which is where we are, is particularly acute. We have the lowest wages of anywhere in the state, anywhere in the country in the South. We have the fewest worker protections. We have the weakest labor laws, etc. And the South, in a weird way, has now become the place where companies go to offshore, except it's actually inshore. So we have companies now moving from the north to the south in search of cheaper wages and less regulation. We see companies moving from Europe to the south, to Tennessee, to South Carolina, to Mississippi, to take advantage of our cheap wages and low union density. And so we have served as kind of a drain on the economy of the entire nation. But I'm almost through cheering you up. I'm sorry, I didn't mean it. But the weird thing now is that because the South has so long served to undercut all of the things that I'm talking about, the North of this country is now becoming the South again. So you see things like Wisconsin, Michigan, Ohio, places that were the bedrock of a strong labor movement and a vibrant middle class, are now suffering the same kinds of political attacks that we've been, frankly, used to for years in the South. And so the question asks, I go back to, are unions necessary? And if unions are necessary, what are we doing about all this? Okay? So the first thing that I think has to happen is that we have to recognize the problem, which I think we've done. Right? Anybody ever heard that? First step towards solving your problem is recognizing you have it. And so we do. So for years and years, unions would have their budgets. They would try and decide, where am I going to allocate my resources? So if you have a choice of saying, okay, I can spend $1 million to organize a new plant in California, and when I do, I'll know that every worker in that plant will join the union and pay dues, and we can have an environment where we won't be under attack all the time, and we already have a bunch of other members there. You know, do I want to do that, or do I want to spend $1 million in Texas where it's going to be a much more difficult thing to win? Even if I win because of right to work, half of the workers probably won't join the union anyway, even though we have to represent them, and we'll be constantly under attack. So where would you spend your money if you were a national union trying to allocate your resources? Well, they would spend it in California. Or if there was a political fight, a presidential election, and it all was going to come down to Ohio because that's where the battleground was, then unions would put their money in Ohio. And we in Texas, Alabama, Louisiana, etc., we would be on our own. And so we, by virtue of our allocation of resources, exacerbated the problem. And the North, we began exporting all these things, starting with things like George Bush, and we wreaked havoc then on the rest of the country. So what the AFL-CIO finally realized was that until we can win in the South, we will not win anywhere. And so they passed the executive board issued a directive that there would be a new effort, this was 2 years ago, to direct large resources to organizing in the South. And furthermore, Alec, we picked 5 cities that we would focus in to start this project. Because, frankly, we can win in cities. We can move a progressive agenda in cities. And hopefully the notion is that when we win in cities, then we will spill out over into other areas and effectively build a winning majority statewide and nationwide. So the 5 cities include Houston and Dallas, among others, Miami, I think Nashville and Atlanta. And so large sums of money are being spent in those places to really build a progressive movement in those places that we're part of. But it takes more than a resolution to build power. And I think we realized that as I think some of y'all were around in 1984 when Jesse Jackson was running for president, and he talked about how we were right on all of the issues, but our quilt wasn't big enough to cover everybody. Anybody remember that quote? That was one of my favorites. And so when we talk about winning for workers in the South and in these cities, we understand that it can't just be labor. It can't just be unions. It has to be, but unions can be the spear, and unions can be a convener of a broad progressive coalition that can win for workers. Community labor partnerships, winning for workers other than through collective bargaining agreements. I just want to talk about a couple of those things. You know, certainly when we talked about General Motors, we talked about by virtue of bargaining is how we set the standards for the rest of the country. We can't really do that anymore because of our scope. But we can do things like the Fight for 15, you know, talking about fast food workers and that everybody who works full-time for a living should have a decent standard of living and should be able to afford to feed themselves and live in a comfortable and safe, secure place and to have health care and retirement. So the Fight for 15 is a broad-based, multi-party campaign to establish the fact that people who work in fast food should make at least $15 an hour. And recently, we had a huge success. This is where the cheering up part starts, so, you know, feel that. Where the National Labor Relations Board issued a decision that said that even though you work for a franchise, that if the parent corporation really is the one controlling your work, then you can bargain with them for the terms and conditions of your employment. So the way it works is that McDonald's is the big company, but they have agreements with these franchisers that say, well, you're really the employer, right? So don't, if anybody's got a problem with their employment, don't talk to us. That's your problem. Well, but McDonald's sets virtually everything in terms of the way they have to run their business, in terms of their costs, in terms of their policies, etc. And so what this decision effectively did was recognize the ruse that McDonald's has engaged in and other companies like it. So hopefully now we'll be able to see campaigns that on a huge scale that will really target the true economic power that's operating in these places and allow us to organize and put pressure. And we've already seen just through the pressure of community organizations, workers themselves standing up, we've seen several companies try and get out in front and talk about how now they're paying their people. And so we hope that will gain momentum. The second thing is the use of what we call community benefit agreements, and that is so many jurisdictions use tax abatements, tax breaks, etc., to lure companies and to aid business. And so to identify like big ones, like where they're redoing the Astrodome or something, and have public pressure be brought to bear on the fact that we want certain wage standards in these things, we want local hiring, we want training, we want health care, we want retirement, all that kind of stuff. That wins for workers. That helps lift the floor for all workers. And basically develop an entire progressive agenda. In one of the things that we did in Texas is that we started these things called Community Labor Leadership Institutes, where we brought together union activists, but also community-based activists who are organizing around similar issues. And in a way that I feel really proud of, we didn't come to them and just say, here's what the play is, we need communities to support us. No, we sat down in a room for a day and we said, what are the big issues that we all face together? And let's come up with a strategy that can win together on something that we all care about. And so that's been exciting. So like in Houston, for example, in the mayor's race, instead of us just saying, well, we support this candidate, we got together with the community organizations. We met. We said, these are the issues that we're going to expect whoever we support for mayor to support, and outline them about wages, health care, right to organize, etc. And then as a group with unions and communities together, we interviewed the candidates, got their responses, and as a group decided that we would support Sylvester Turner for that race. And now the benefit of that is that now we're all working together to get him elected and allow us to bring a progressive agenda to that. Same thing is happening in Dallas. And Dallas is an amazing place in that the entire south of Dallas is a food desert. A food desert. And what is a food desert? A food desert is there are no full-service grocery stores in a very large swath of Dallas, south of I-20, and so of course people don't eat healthily. And there's no economic engine attached to that. And so together with some community organizations, the labor movement is leading the fight to locate a full-service grocery store in South Dallas. And as part of it, it's going to one of the demands, one of the ways that we're focusing is that it should be a grocery store that pays a living wage, provides health care, sells healthy food, has access to hiring for local people and training for local people who live in that area. And so through this model of community-based economic development, we hope to drive an agenda through the entire Dallas City Council with this as the first step. And that's just another example of how there'll be no there may be a collective bargaining agreement. It may be a union grocery store. If Kroger is a union grocery store in Dallas, it may be them. But if it's not, it will be a model for economic development. It will work to set the standards to raise the floor for all workers. And so that kind of thing, coming together, identifying what our goals are, how we can work together to drive a progressive agenda, is what the labor movement is investing its future in Texas. So what I would just say is that I'm really excited about that. I'm really excited about going all over the state and figuring out how we can weave together these groups of people who have similar ideas and similar goals to really do what we accomplished through collective bargaining 50 years ago. Now we are going to have to accomplish through economic and political organizing on a scale that we've not seen it. It feels really exciting that there are unions that have really bought into this fully. Like, for example, the teachers union has hired some 50-plus organizers in the last couple of years with the express goal of organizing enough workers, teachers, and school personnel in the state to make a huge difference, not only in the school districts, but politically, and, to stand up for public education, which is probably one of the biggest fights we have in this country. When you talk about completely dismantling the social safety net and what makes us a democracy, public education stands at the very core. And so when you have an organization like the Texas Federation of Teachers making a huge commitment to that and making a huge commitment to this kind of new organizing strategy, it gives you great hope for really what we'll be able to accomplish as we move forward. But it's not all just good news, because the other side has kind of noticed what's going on. And it used to be that local control was a good thing, right? Got it? Especially for conservative people, the idea of local control, getting big government off our back, was kind of a big deal. And so, for years, that was the mantra of the conservative movement. And so when the local people started doing things like trying to raise the minimum wage, trying to ban fracking in city limits, but the next legislative session we had a bill passed and signed by Governor Bush that did make it illegal for cities to raise the minimum wage. So now, in last session, Denton passed a law that would regulate fracking within the city limits. So this session we got a law that made it illegal for cities to regulate fracking within the city limits. There were also laws that would prohibit cities from regulating payday lending. There were laws that would prohibit cities from requiring a living wage in their contracting. There was one broad law that just said cities can't do anything if it's touched in state law at all. And so we see a very concerted effort to take away the power of local authorities to improve the lives of folks in their jurisdictions, and that has also sown the seeds of a very broad-based coalition against that, and we will be fighting that on and on as we move forward. As we have more and more success on the local level, I think we'll see more and more efforts at the state capitol to try and drive that. And then finally, what happened during the last legislative session was an attempt to actually put unions out of business in Texas, and we took that a little bit seriously. It's amazing what a little existential threat will do to motivate you during difficult times. So, anybody here heard of the Koch brothers? So they have a little outfit in Texas called the Texas Public Policy Foundation. And the Texas Public Policy Foundation is what I would call kind of a right-wing launching pad of horrible things. And they occupy a very central place in Texas politics. They had a very high degree of influence with Governor Perry for years. He was kind of their patron saint, and they would feed him the ideas, and he would get them passed. To the point where now they're so successful that they recently opened their new palace to conservatism on the corner of 10th in Congress or 9th in Congress, a whole new city block of offices with little pithy sayings all over it as a monument to their conservatism. So they issued a white paper about how it was so important that we keep Texas union free. That was the highest call for Texas politicians now in order to safeguard the Texas miracle. And the way that the first thing they recommended that we do in order to do that didn't have anything to do with private sector workplaces or anything like that. They proposed making it illegal for a public employee, a teacher, a city employee, a county employee, to make it illegal for any of these folks to voluntarily have their dues deducted from their paycheck. They rightly recognize that if you make somebody, if you take away the convenience of saying, I just want my dues to go to my union, and make them write a check every week or every month, or give somebody their credit card, that where that has happened in the past, unions have lost approximately 40% of their membership overnight. And so from this policy think tank, this was the number one item that was put forward as a way to solve our economic problems in this state. And it found very sympathetic ears among Governor Abbott and Lieutenant Governor Patrick, who made it a very high priority. And so the last legislative session was spent with Eric's help and leadership trying to fend off this notion that an adult employee of a public entity should have the basic economic freedom to say, I want a portion of my dues, of my paycheck, to go to my union dues. We say you can do it for your health care coverage, you can do it for United Way, you can do it for any number of charitable organizations, but we're going to say for unions you can't do it. And they raise the specter of coercive unions and big brother union man coming and stealing people's money and using government funds to take poor taxpayers' money. And we're able to defeat that by the skin of our teeth, but we know that will be coming again next session. And it's our hope that through the kind of organizing that we're doing, the kind of building of a broad progressive movement that we're doing, that we'll be in position to stop that next time too. I should also say one other thing, and this is a little controversial, but it is what's going on, is that historically speaking in Texas, the labor movement has been pretty much attached to the Democratic Party. And I can recall our endorsements were always things like, we endorse Mr. Jones, Mrs. Smith, and all Democrats. And that may have served us at one point, but it doesn't serve us at this point. There are Democrats that frankly are not worthy of our support just because they have a D by their name. And as we move to a more politics-driven agenda, where we set the agenda and we expect candidates to follow it as opposed to we support candidates and hope they follow our agenda, we hope to have a much higher degree of support from Democratic candidates that we support. And I will say that during this last legislative session, the Democratic caucuses in both the House and the Senate were extremely united and vigorous in their support of us on this existential battle, and we couldn't have prevailed without them. But I'll also say that there were several Republicans who agreed with us on this issue, who found this as a broad overreach to governmental power, who felt that it was hypocritical that we would stand for economic freedom but yet tell hardworking public servants that they shouldn't have the right to do with their money what they please. And we're also a little bit disturbed that certain public employees, for example, firefighters and police, were exempted from the coverage of the bill. Why? Not because they're any different, because as the sponsor of the bill told me, they told us it would be a lot harder to pass if we had to beat the police and the firefighters too. So that hypocrisy, I think, also rang true. And we had several Republicans who were extremely helpful to us. And so this next legislative session, you're going to see unions being extremely supportive of certain people who helped us. And that's going to be different, but it's, again, part of an agenda-driven politics. And we think that in the long term, that's what holds the best likelihood of success as we move forward. So I guess what I would say in answer to my own question, and it's a lot easier to answer your questions when they're your own question. I imagine this may be a little more difficult as we move to the next phase, but my question was, are unions necessary today? And my answer would be that not only are they necessary, but they are fundamental and, in fact, are going to play a cutting-edge role in leading the fight, not just for working people's rights, but to safeguard the very core of our democracy. And so that's what we're going to be working on as we move forward. And I very much appreciate y'all listening so kindly on a Sunday morning to those views, and look forward to the dialogue as we move forward.
Thank you, Rick. And now we'll take audience questions.
Thanks so much. I'm really interested what role unions will play in the 2016 election and how you go about determining who, what, when, or also anything you can tell us about 2016 and what the unions will do. Greatly appreciate it.
Well, that's a great question. It's very timely, given that it's 2015. I don't know if you knew that. So it's interesting. There's the way it works, well, with some exceptions, no offense. The way it works is that it's supposed to be a democratic process where to get an endorsement, I assume you're talking about the presidential race, to get an endorsement you need 2/3 vote of all the members of the executive board. And what I would tell you about that is that obviously there's Hillary Clinton, whose people have probably heard of, who is working hard to try and get labor support. And you'll also notice that so far she has not received an official AFL-CIO endorsement, that a couple of unions, the teachers union has endorsed her. I think one other one has, but as a whole, the union has not. And what I want to relate to you that's exciting about that is that I know from discussions that endorsement is not just going to be given, that it's going to have to be earned. And what I mean by that, and I'm not saying it wasn't earned by the teachers because they have a separate set of issues, but we've seen, and I think people are frustrated that we've seen now a Democratic president push through a free trade agreement that people feel is not in the interest of working people. And I think we've seen a Treasury Department that has not exercised the full weight of its authority on things like interest rates, bank policies, et cetera, to really benefit working people. And I think there's frustration with that. And so I think there's a lot of conversation going on right now with the campaigns, trying to move those campaigns to commit to positions that are going to be important for working people moving forward. So it's not personality driven, but it's much more issue based. And so I think that kind of background conversation is going to be going on. I think there was some frustration that Hillary didn't take a strong position against the free trade agreement. So I think Bernie Sanders has tapped into a lot of that and said all the right things. As it moves forward, we'll see how it goes. I think if Secretary Clinton will stake out positions that people feel are in accord with our values, then that'll take care of itself. But that'll be the process going forward.
Yeah, there's always been a struggle between capital and labor. In the past, the unions were the ones that were a counterbalance to capital, and they've really been hurt. And government has not stepped in the way to make themselves a balance. So how can that be changed in the future?
That's the core question, and that's what I tried to say at the beginning. You said it much more artfully and concisely. Is that what is the counterbalance to unchecked capital now? And I think what we've decided is that it's kind of organizing on a broader scale than we've ever tried to do before, because we can't count on government to do it, because government's a captive of the same things that we're fighting every day. And so we have to build an independent movement that can hold government and corporations accountable. And I think that, by trying to do this new strategy in the South, broad-based community, and investing in places where we haven't done before, hopefully that will help get us to the point where that's it. But your question is exactly right.
Thank you so much for your talk today.
Thank you.
As a union member, I'm delighted to hear the enthusiasm and plans that you discussed today. In the past, we got a lot of visibility by marching in the streets and making clear these statements about people's lives. What are our plans in the future to be more visible and to create more of a spirit that people can see and become part of?
That is such a great question. Thank you for that. One of the greatest marches that I think I've been in the last 10 years was the March for Immigration Rights. When we marched through downtown Austin with union members, undocumented workers, immigrants, et cetera, all demanding a level of dignity for everybody. And I think that your question is actually, I don't have a good answer for you because I don't have a plan about that, but I'm moved by your question to think about how to best do that, because I think I felt like I was so uplifted by that and motivated by that, and it was such a visible thing that it really changed the way people were thinking about it just by virtue of that. Obviously the March on Washington did the same thing. I think a lot of times, if it's not planned right, it can end up sapping energy as opposed to creating energy. But I think that I'm going to have to think about, and I thank you for that, I'm going to have to think about what would be a good plan in terms of visibility to do that, because I think that is, and I think sometimes in Austin we can get kind of myopia based on the fact that we're dealing with a big pink granite building and, you know, all this kind of stuff that we need to get back to thinking about that. So next year when I'm here, I'll give you a really good answer about that. But thanks for the question, Rich. I appreciate it.
Thank you for your presentation. I'm also a lifetime union member. I think there's an area that you're neglecting to capitalize on. I want to suggest that when people understand that the reason Walmart is so successful is because taxpayers are paying for their employees.
Exactly.
The reason these large corporations like McDonald's are successful is because the taxpayers are paying for their employees.
Exactly.
And I don't think you're making that clear. It's not made clear in the media. It's not made clear to the general public. And I think that would be a huge way to change the way people look at these issues like a living wage, because if you pay people a living wage, they don't need to be.
Exactly.
When I taught school for 20 years, we had a large percentage of our teachers that were on food stamps.
Yeah. The first thing is that if you really think about it, and what we've always said is the most effective government program is a job, okay, and that that if you allow people to collectively bargain, and you know that's the private sector. You don't need government if people are paid a living wage, right? You don't need all those the more people that are lifted up through a job, the less people we support through public benefit. But it's so frustrating. I work on the issue of workers' compensation, and in workers' compensation, when you get hurt on the job, you're supposed to have insurance that covers your medical benefit, and you get a certain payment to help you until you get back to work, right? So Texas is the only state in the country that doesn't require employers to carry any form of workers' comp. So an employer can say, we don't have workers' comp here. If you get hurt, you're on your own, okay? So about a third of the employees in Texas go to work every day and have no protection from workers' compensation. So what happens when they get hurt? So we're at the Capitol and we're talking about that very question. So if you don't require this employer to carry this workers' compensation, who's going to pay for it when they get hurt? It's me and it's you. It's through uncompensated charity care at a hospital. Is that the way we want it? So you have a business, for example, who have now started to see this. If a business pays it pays for workers' compensation coverage, they pay those premiums. But now they're also going to be paying for their competitor who doesn't want to pay those premiums when their workers get hurt. And so that same argument about, it's frankly just a giveaway to these corporations that we are paying, as taxpayers, we're paying their health care premiums. It's a subsidy. That's exactly what it is. And you're right, we need to get that word out because I think people would be responsive to it. It's just hard when you don't have as big a microphone. I mean, if I could walk around with this thing on my head all day, people would know about it, but I don't. I hear you.
Are there any efforts to get a labor party so we can have candidates on a state and federal level?
There are efforts to that effect. I think that what we see is kind of because I think there's something very attractive about having somebody that's just going to be speaking for you, right? They're going to share your values completely. They're going to be, and I think there's been a long time since that would be a good thing. I think that the problem is the way our political structure is the way our political system is structured. That to do that, you effectively limit your voice in a certain way because of it's like we don't have the 3-party or 4-party system where 2 different parties can still support the same person from a different perspective, like they do in New York, for example, the Working Families Party. And so what we've tried to do, I think, is a kind of a compromise on that, which is to say we're going to condition our support on your support of our thing, and hold the candidates that we do support that are either Republicans or Democrats to a more accountable standard based on our values. Because I think what you're trying to get at is the frustration of continually supporting candidates who then turn around and don't support us. And so I think this is the way we're doing it, hopefully, is a way of getting at that goal without kind of suffering what would happen in the short term in terms of trying to get that off the ground. I think that that's a longer discussion. Maybe we should have that one with a little more depth.
I'm a former human resources executive.
Great.
And I was a very ethical one, which did not end well for me. And I'm wondering if, well, that's debatable, but anyway, I'm wondering if there are any efforts to, one, rehaul the whole EEO ADA system, because I think it's ineffective, because the only people who ever have recourse are those who can afford six-figure legal bills. In my experience, there aren't labor lawyers taking contingency cases much. And so I would love to see every single employee unionized in the U.S. in every job. And I'm just wondering if it's even worth it. It may not be, for efforts for labor leaders such as yourself to reach out to either SHRM, who are probably not friendly, but maybe, I don't know, or other human resources executives in any way. And on top of that, I'm wondering if there are any codes of ethics for general counsel, because I've seen general counsel in companies violate labor laws left and right. And I'm wondering if the Bar Association has any recourse for them, if that can be an effort.
All right. Thanks for the question. I'll give you two things in response to that. The first one, in terms of ethical human resources folks, I remember when I was still trying lawsuits, and I had a kind of a big case up in Waco. And you know how when you pick the jury, you have to decide who you want to knock off the jury. And I thought the case was a very egregious case of discrimination. And so one of the potential jurors that we were considering was a human resources professional. And my co-counsel said, well, we have to get rid of them. You know, they're an HR person. I said, well, you know, the HR person should know how this is going to, they should know what the best practices are and how this works. And I bet that they are going to be outraged by what they hear. And so we left that person on, and that person ended up being the foreman, and we got a really good verdict from them. So it does happen. I understand what you're saying. In terms of the overall question of the ADA and stuff like that, one interesting thing is that, you can be fired in this country or in Texas actually, for a good reason, a bad reason, or no reason at all, because we're at-will employees. And if you're fired for trying to organize a union, then that's a violation of federal law, and that is for the National Labor Relations Board to investigate and put you back to work. But the consequences of doing that, if you're an employer, are minimal. You don't have to pay any kind of penalty. You just have to pay the back wages. And so there are some who are arguing that we should make union organizing a civil right, and that if you're fired for trying to organize a union, you should be able to have access to the courts just like you do if you're fired for your race or your sex or your age, your national origin, your religion. Making the point that it's really a human right and a civil right to engage in concerted activities with your fellow employees. And so I think that will be the dialogue that moves forward. And if that happens, it'll obviously have impact on the kinds of things that you're raising.
We have a question from Ham Richards. Ham, would you stand, please?
In his most recent column, Nicholas Kristof referred back to a February column in which he announced that he was changing his attitude towards unions from one of some disdain because of various abuses to one of full-throated support.
Yeah.
I'm wondering whether this is in any way typical of a change in opinion among opinion leaders in this country, and if so, is it coming in time?
What a perceptive question. Absolutely. I thought that was an amazing column, and I think that it has already had an impact, and I don't think it's too late. One of the things that's happened recently is in our online world, so many of the different online media outlets, the workers in these places have decided that a union is the way for them to have a voice as well. So, I'm going to sound like a whatever. I'm not so good with the digital stuff, but things like Gawker and BuzzFeed and all these kind of cutting-edge organizations, their employees have now, in very public ways, organized themselves into unions. And as they write about their experiences, it has amazing relevance to folks who are in the digital world where unions have been not a vibrant force. And so but they take all kinds of new and different forms. It's like it's not, Daddy going to the factory every day for 50 years and and ending up with a pension and retiring. It's totally new economic forms, and it's the folks that are in those forms that are really going to be shaping what that looks like. But so I do think that it's getting to be kind of hip to be union, which is a good thing.
Have I missed any people wanting to ask questions? Okay, well, we'll get back to you, Erica, in just a moment.
Yeah. That was part of the deal. No questions from Eric.
Just an announcement. Vicki Worsham is wanting to honor Kitty Clark and honor you, Rick, and organized labor. She's supplied a lot of cookies, which are outside, and we hope that you all can stick around and talk about the talk and meet Rick Levy afterwards.
Yeah, I neglected to say how important cookies were to the labor movement.
I've done a few bake sales.
I regret the oversight. Yes, ma'am.
One thing, I feel as though I've been out of touch with the local news. Is there a newsletter I could receive?
Wow. Okay.
Is there email?
Okay, so did our communications director pay you, and if so, how much to say that?
No.
Yes,
I'm
I will.
A great champion
All right.
of Kitty Clark.
Okay, as am I. So I'll give you an email address, and if you want, you can just send an email, and I will get you put on. We have two ways. We have two things about that. One is a daily email that's put up by our communication director, who covers kind of all the things that he thinks are interesting from a union perspective in today's development. So the email address would be ed, which is spelled ED, and then @ and the @ is the thing right above the 2 on the computer's typing. You have to press down the shift key, and then Texas, all spelled out, TEXAFL-CIO, TEXAS-AFL-CIO.org, and just say, please put me on your newsletter, and then you'll get it. And then he'll give you all kinds of ways to link into the kind of work that we do from there.
I think we have about 5 minutes left. Eric?
Right, I've got a couple for you, Rick, in spite of any prior arrangement.
Yes.
One, I wanted to hear
Wait a second. And also, thank you for the cookies.
Right.
All right.
I wanted to hear something about Labor Environmental Alliances, the Blue-Green Alliance, which I know a little bit about, but not enough.
Okay.
And a separate question I'd like you to address. We heard from Jack Getman, law professor, a few years ago at one of these Labor Day forums about labor law reform. He suggested that the most significant thing that could happen would be for the Supreme Court to reinterpret the issue of the secondary boycott. So I wonder if you might address what that would mean.
Wow. Okay. Those are big ones. Address the blue-green one first, because I have much more to say about that. One of my frustrations is in terms of the issues that we've had to deal with is the issue of pollution emissions, which I think you addressed. And, a big portion of our membership is engaged in refineries, mining, and coal plants. And so that's a really important piece of what we do, is representing the folks that work in that industry and making sure that they're treated with fairness, dignity, and respect, and that what we do reflects their needs and their desires. On the other hand, we have folks who are electricians, other kinds of building trades folks, and in other industries who are concerned about kind of environmental issues as they address. And so there was this whole kind of pitting of union members against environmentalists, and that showed up in different legislative battles as an issue would come about whether to close a coal mine or a coal plant, and we would support the coal plant and the coal mine because that's where our members work, and we would be at odds with the environmentalists. And so there was a rethinking of that on a kind of a national level and on a state level to identify where our long-term interests lay and if there was a way that we could work together. And what came out of that was the Blue-Green Alliance. And the Blue-Green Alliance blue for blue collar, green for like green. Well, I don't think it's green collar. It's kind of like, you know what I mean. To try and say that yes, we're going to have disputes about certain things, but fundamentally, long term, isn't there a strategy where we can develop a new economy based on a green economy? So can't we work together to grow solar power, where where even as we work in more traditional energy industries, can't we grow solar power, where union electricians will install union-made solar plant panels on people's houses and save money and save costs, and develop a new jobs agenda? You know, the automobile was the economic driver of a century of economic growth in this country. And so the idea being that a new transition to a new green economy could be a similar economic engine, and to try and work with environmentalists to make sure that as we do that, those jobs are good. There was no decree back in the day that auto workers should make a decent salary with a pension and health care. It didn't just happen. It was struggle. It was fighting. It was sit-down strikes. It was demonstrations, and what resulted was workers getting a share of the new economy created by the automobile. So it's kind of bringing that same approach to the new green economy, so that when these new industries arise, they're also industries that pay a decent wage, provide a career ladder, and things like that. So that's kind of what's working on that environmentally. Then, with respect to your labor law reform question, I'm not the lawyer anymore. I'm the secretary-treasurer, so I don't have to deal with that. But it is frustrating, there's all these arcane labor law rules about who you can picket against and who you can't, and who you can demonstrate against and who you can't, because it's too powerful if you can just picket against anybody you want to, even if they're not involved in the dispute. So I don't know exactly what Professor Getman said, but knowing Professor Getman, I would say I think exactly what he thought.
Well, we want to thank you for taking time to come and talk with us. Very important talk, Rick. And you promise you'll be willing to come back again?
Absolutely. I'm sure we can make it work. I'll have my people get with your people.
Very good. Hey, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.